in the autumn of 1238, in the village of Ashford near the River Stour, a young miller's apprentice named Oswald tends to the daily rhythms of grain and stone, water and wheel. Good evening. I am grateful you are here tonight. Tonight's story will carry us to a medieval mill in southern England, where we will follow Oswald through his peaceful work with flour and grain. Let yourself settle in, get comfortable, and know that there is nowhere else you need to be. This story will be here, unfolding slowly for as long as you need. The first light of dawn touched the mill through gaps in the wooden shutters, pale and silver. Oswald, 17 years old with flour-dusted hands and sandy brown hair, woke to the familiar sound of water moving past the great wheel outside. The air in the loft held the scent of milled wheat and old timber, comfortable and known. He stretched beneath his wool blanket, feeling the pleasant ache in his shoulders from yesterday's work, the kind that spoke of tasks completed rather than burdens carried. The morning chill touched his face as he rose, but the mill retained warmth from the day before. The massive wooden structure holding heat like bread holds its softness after baking. He hummed plain chant melodies while dressing, a habit learned from the monks who sometimes brought grain from the abbey 3 miles distant. His tunic, patched at the elbows, settled over his shoulders with the ease of countless wearings. When Oswald descended the ladder to the main floor, the mill greeted him with its own particular music. The wheel outside turned with its endless patient rhythm, powered by the river's steady current. Wooden gears meshed and released, their teeth worn smooth by years of motion. Light entered through the doorway, casting amber patterns across the floor where dust motes drifted like tiny stars suspended in honey. The millstones waited, the upper stone resting quiet against the lower. Oswald ran his palm across the cool granite surface, tracing the furrows cut deep into the rock. Each groove had been carved by his master's father, then deepened by years of grain passing through, a pattern that knew its purpose as thoroughly as the river knew its bed. The stone felt solid beneath his touch, unchanged and unchanging. He made his way outside, where the morning had brightened to reveal mist rising from the river. The water flowed past, dark and smooth, carrying leaves that spun slowly in small eddies near the bank. The great wheel turned, dripping and patient, each paddle lifting water that fell back in silver streams. Oswald watched this motion for several breaths, finding the deep contentment that always came when he observed the wheel's work. The path to the grain storage led past his master's cottage, where smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, steady line. Margaret, the miller's wife, 41 years old, with capable hands and graying auburn hair, emerged carrying a wooden pail. She nodded to Oswald with the easy acknowledgement of people who share the same daily rounds. "The bread is almost ready," she said, her voice carrying the mild warmth of someone who has risen with dawn for decades. "There will be porridge as well." Oswald thanked her and continued to the storage shed, where sacks of grain stood stacked against the walls. The building smelled of wheat and barley, dry and faintly sweet, a scent that mixed with the earthen floor beneath his feet. He selected 3 sacks for the morning's work, testing their weight in his arms before hoisting the first onto his shoulder. The walk back to the mill took him through morning air that had warmed slightly, carrying the scent of distant wood smoke from the village hearths. A robin sang from the willow tree near the water's edge, its melody clear and unhurried. Oswald paused to listen, feeling no urgency to move faster than the day itself seemed to move. Inside the mill, he poured grain into the hopper, watching as the kernels tumbled and settled. The sound they made was like rain on thatch, gentle and continuous. He adjusted the lever that would allow grain to feed between the stones, then engaged the mechanism that connected the wheel's power to the millstone's rotation. The upper stone began to turn, slow and massive, grinding against its partner with a sound that filled the space, not loud but present in every corner, a low rumble that spoke of work being done without haste. Flour began to emerge from the gap between the stones, pale and fine, drifting down into the wooden trough below. Oswald watched this transformation, grain becoming flour, the same miracle he had witnessed hundreds of times but which never lost its quiet satisfaction. He hummed plain chant melodies while working, letting the music blend with the mill's own song. The stones turned. The wheel outside continued its patient rotation. Light from the doorway shifted as the sun climbed higher, moving across the floor in its slow arc. By mid-morning, the first batch of flour rested in the collection trough, soft as new snow. Oswald scooped it into a clean cloth sack, tying the top with twine. The fabric felt cool against his flour-dusted hands, and he brushed his palms against his tunic before lifting the sack to set it with the others already filled. Margaret appeared in the doorway with bread and a bowl of porridge, steam rising from both. She set them on the wooden bench near the wall, and Oswald moved to accept this kindness. The bread was dark and dense, still faintly warm, and the porridge held the sweetness of honey stirred through oats. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, while the mill continued its work behind him. "The baker will come this afternoon," Margaret said, settling onto the bench beside him. "He mentioned needing extra flour for the market day tomorrow." Oswald nodded, calculating in his mind how many more sacks he would need to prepare. The thought held no stress, only the pleasant awareness of tasks that would unfold in their own time. Margaret sat quietly, her own work temporarily set aside, and together they listened to the mill's steady voice. When the meal was finished, Oswald returned to the hopper to add more grain. The day had warmed enough that he opened the shutters wider, allowing fresh air to move through the space. The breeze carried the scent of the river and growing things, mixing with the flower's dusty sweetness. He breathed deeply, feeling his body settle into the rhythm of work that required attention but not strain. The hours passed in this manner, measured by the turning of stones and the accumulation of flour. Oswald checked the mechanisms regularly, listening for any change in the mill's voice that might signal a problem, but everything ran as smoothly as the water that powered it. His master had taught him to trust his ears as much as his eyes, to know the mill's moods through sound alone. In the early afternoon, when the sun reached its highest point and poured through the doorway in a wash of golden light, Oswald paused his work to step outside. The warmth touched his face and arms, pleasant after the mill's cooler interior. He walked to the river's edge, where willows trailed their branches in the current, and crouched to cup water in his palms. The coldness was shocking and welcome, and he splashed his face, feeling dust and weariness wash away. The river moved past, endless and unhurried, carrying the reflection of sky and clouds on its surface. Oswald watched a leaf drift by, spinning slowly, following a path it had no choice but to take. Somewhere downstream, the river would meet other waters, growing wider and slower until it reached the sea. But here, in this moment, it was simply the river he had known all his life, faithful and unchanging in its constancy. He returned to the mill with water still cool on his skin, his sandy brown hair darkened where dampness clung. The stones continued their rotation, and he checked the flour accumulating in the trough, pale, and even the texture his master had taught him to recognize as proper. Oswald scooped more into sacks, his flour-dusted hands moving with the ease of long practice. The baker arrived as the afternoon light began its gradual shift toward amber. Thomas, 53 years old, with a round belly and silver-streaked black hair, entered the mill carrying empty sacks over his shoulder. The scent of yeast and baked bread clung to his clothing, mingling with the mill's own dusty sweetness. "Good day to you, Oswald," Thomas said, setting down his sacks with a satisfied sigh. "The wheel sounds as content as ever." "It has been turning steady all morning," Oswald replied, gesturing to the filled sacks waiting along the wall. "I have 8 ready, and 2 more will be complete before vespers." Thomas nodded, running his palm across one of the sacks to test the flour's fineness through the cloth. His expression showed the quiet approval of a craftsman recognizing good work. "This will serve well for tomorrow's market bread. The Reeve's wife has requested extra loaves, and half the village seems to have remembered they need baking done." The 2 men worked together to transfer the sacks, a comfortable silence settling between them, broken only by the mill's steady voice and the soft sounds of their labor. Oswald appreciated Thomas's unhurried manner, the way the baker moved with deliberation rather than haste, as though bread and time were old companions who understood each other's pace. When the sacks were loaded onto Thomas's cart outside, the baker reached into his pouch and produced a small honey cake wrapped in cloth. "From my wife," he said, pressing it into Oswald's hand. "She remembers you helped repair our oven stones last month." Oswald accepted the gift with gratitude, feeling the cake's slight warmth through the fabric. The gesture carried the weight of community, of favors given and returned, a web of kindness that held the village together as surely as mortar held stones. Thomas departed with a wave, his cart creaking along the path toward the village, and Oswald stood watching until the baker disappeared beyond the willows. The afternoon continued its peaceful progression. Oswald swept flour from the mill floor, gathering it carefully. Even the dustings were valuable, suitable for animal feed or the coarsest bread. His broom, made of bundled birch twigs, whispered across the worn floorboards. Dust motes swirled in the slanting light, each particle catching the sun like tiny fragments of gold suspended in air thick with the day's work. By the time the church bells rang for vespers, their distant bronze voices carrying across the fields, Oswald had prepared the final 2 sacks Thomas would collect the next morning. He engaged the lever that disconnected the millstones from the wheel's power, and the grinding sound gradually ceased. The wheel outside continued its rotation. It would turn through the night, through all nights, as long as the river flowed. But inside, the mill settled into a different kind of quiet. Oswald climbed the ladder to the loft where he slept, carrying the honey cake Thomas had given him. The space under the eaves held his few possessions: a spare tunic folded on a shelf, a wooden cup, a small knife for eating, a bundle of herbs Margaret had given him for freshening the straw mattress. Evening light filtered through gaps in the roof boards, painting stripes across the floor. He sat on his mattress and unwrapped the honey cake, breaking off a piece. The sweetness spread across his tongue, honey and oats, with the faint warmth of cinnamon that must have cost Thomas dearly. Oswald ate slowly, savoring each bite, while below him the mill creaked and settled, its timbers adjusting to the day's end like an old man easing into his chair. Through the small window cut into the gable, he could see the river reflecting the deepening sky. Swallows swooped and darted above the water, catching insects in the last good light. Their flight seemed effortless, full of grace that came from doing what they were made to do. Oswald watched them until the light faded too much for his eyes to follow their paths. The next morning arrived with mist thick as wool across the river. Oswald, 17 years old, woke to whiteness beyond the window and dampness in the air that made his wool blanket feel heavier, more sheltered. He hummed plain-chant melodies while dressing, the music barely audible above his breath. The mill below was silent except for the wheel's eternal turning, and he descended the ladder into cool air that smelled of river water and stone. He pushed open the door to find the world transformed by fog. The willows were gray shapes, barely visible. The path to the cottage had disappeared entirely, though he knew every stone and rut by heart. Sound traveled strangely in such weather. The wheel's splash seemed both closer and more distant, as though the mist confused even the ears about what was near and what was far. Margaret emerged from the cottage like a figure stepping out of clouds, carrying a covered basket. Her graying auburn hair was braided and pinned, and her capable hands held the basket steady as she made her way to where Oswald stood. "I thought you might want company for breakfast," she said, her voice muted by the mist. "Days like this feel strange when you are alone." They sat together on the bench inside the mill, and Margaret unpacked bread, cheese, and apples from her basket. The bread was yesterday's baking, still good, and the cheese was sharp and crumbly. Oswald cut slices with his eating knife, and they ate while watching the mist shift and swirl beyond the doorway. "My husband will return tomorrow," Margaret said after a while. The grain merchants in Canterbury were slow to settle their accounts, he said in his message, but the business is concluded now. Oswald nodded. His master, William, 60 years old with gnarled hands and a beard more white than gray, had been gone for 5 days. The mill had continued its work in his absence, as it always did, but Oswald would be glad to have the older man's presence again. William moved through the world with a sureness that came from decades of understanding grain and water, stone and wood. When the meal was finished, Margaret gathered the basket and departed into the mist. Oswald watched her form fade to gray, then to nothing, before he turned back to the mill's interior. The day's work waited, more grain to process, mechanisms to check, the endless patient attention that kept the mill running well. He filled the hopper and engaged the stones, and their grinding voice filled the space once more. The mist outside began to thin as morning progressed, revealing the world in stages. First the near willows, then the far bank, finally the fields beyond where sheep grazed in their own unhurried patterns. Oswald worked steadily, his flour-dusted hands moving through tasks he could have completed in darkness if necessary. At midday, a farmer arrived with a cart carrying 4 large sacks of barley. Edmund, 38 years old, with sun-weathered skin and straw-colored hair, helped Oswald unload the grain into the storage shed. The barley had a different scent than wheat, earthier, with a hint of the field still clinging to each kernel. "This is for ale," Edmund explained, brushing chaff from his tunic. "My wife wants the ground finer than usual. She has promised the Reeves household 3 barrels before the harvest festival." Oswald assured him the barley would be ready in 2 days, ground to whatever fineness Edmund's wife required. The farmer departed, and Oswald added the barley milling to his mental accounting of tasks. Not a burden, simply another element in the pattern of work that gave shape to his days. The afternoon brought clearer skies, and Oswald opened all the shutters to allow light and air to move freely through the mill. Swallows had built nests in the eaves outside, and he could hear their chicks crying for food, a sound that spoke of life continuing in its appointed rounds. The parent birds darted in and out, tireless in their devotion, and Oswald found himself pausing to watch their efficiency. He hummed plain-chant melodies while checking the millstones for wear, running his fingers along the furrows to feel for any irregularity. The stone was cool and slightly rough beneath his touch, unchanged from his morning inspection. Everything in the mill had a proper feel, a correct sound, and Oswald had learned to trust these senses as guides to the machinery's health. By late afternoon, when shadows grew long and the light turned golden, Oswald had completed enough work that he felt comfortable taking time to walk to the village. He secured the mill, leaving the wheel to turn unattended. It required no supervision, only the river's faithful current, and made his way along the path that followed the watercourse. The village of Ashford consisted of perhaps 40 households clustered around a small stone church. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and the air carried the mingled scents of baking bread, roasting meat, and the earthy smell of animals bedded down for the evening. Children played near the common well, their laughter bright and uncomplicated, while women gathered to draw water and exchange the day's news. Oswald nodded greetings to those he passed, receiving warm acknowledgments in return. The blacksmith, hammering at his anvil even as the day waned, raised a hand without pausing in his work. The priest, emerging from the church after afternoon prayers, offered a blessing that Oswald accepted with a bowed head. These small interactions formed the texture of village life, each thread connecting to others in a pattern too large and complex to see all at once. He stopped at the baker's shop, where Thomas was banking his ovens for the night. The interior glowed with residual heat, and the scent of bread was so thick it seemed almost visible, like the mist of morning made edible and golden. "The flour worked beautifully," Thomas said, wiping his hands on his apron. "Not a single loaf failed to rise properly. Your master will be pleased when he hears." Pride touched Oswald's chest. not the sharp pride that demands recognition, but the deeper satisfaction of work done well, of standards maintained. He thanked Thomas and continued his walk, circling through the village until the light began to fail and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The walk back to the mill followed a path he could have traced blindfolded. His feet knew every rise and dip, every stone that might turn an ankle if stepped on carelessly. The river's voice grew louder as he approached, and the mill's bulk appeared as a darker shape against the twilight. The wheel continued its rotation, visible now only as movement and sound, the splash of water constant as breathing. Inside, Oswald lit a tallow candle, its flame small but sufficient. The light pushed back shadows without banishing them entirely, creating a space that felt both enclosed and vast. He climbed to the loft, carrying the candle carefully, and prepared for sleep by removing his outer tunic and loosening the ties at his throat. The mattress received him with familiar comfort, and he lay listening to the mill's nighttime sounds. The wheels splash, the creak of timbers, the small movements of mice in the walls pursuing their own nocturnal purposes. Through the window, stars were visible, scattered across the sky in patterns he had learned to recognize but whose names he had never been taught. Sleep came gradually, like the mist had come that morning, not all at once, but in layers that deepened until consciousness gave way to rest. Oswald's last waking thought was of the river, flowing in darkness as it flowed in light, faithful and unchanging, the source of everything the mill did and was. Morning returned with bird song and the pale wash of dawn across the loft's wooden beams. Oswald, 17 years old, stretched beneath his blanket before rising, his flour-dusted hands reaching for his tunic. The air held autumn's increasing coolness, pleasant against his skin as he dressed. He hummed plain chant melodies while descending the ladder, the music joining with the wheel's steady rhythm outside. The mill greeted him with its familiar scents, grain dust, old timber, the faint mineral smell of the grinding stones. Oswald moved to the door and pushed it open, revealing a morning clear and bright. Dew silvered the grass along the riverbank, and the water flowed smooth and dark, carrying reflections of clouds that drifted overhead like sheep across a blue pasture. He walked to the river's edge and crouched to splash water on his face. The coldness shocked him pleasantly awake, droplets running down his neck and soaking into his tunic collar. A heron stood in the shallows downstream, motionless as a carved figure, waiting with the patience that came naturally to creatures who knew their prey would eventually arrive. The sound of hoofbeats drew Oswald's attention to the path. His master, William, 60 years old with gnarled hands and a beard more white than gray, approached on his sturdy mare. The horse moved with the unhurried gait of an animal returning home, and William sat easy in the saddle, his posture relaxed despite days of travel. "Good morning, Oswald," William called as he drew near. His voice carried the rough warmth of a man who spoke little but meant what he said. "The mill sounds content. You have done well." Oswald helped his master dismount, then led the mare to the small stable beside the cottage while William stretched and rolled his shoulders. The horse nuzzled Oswald's shoulder, her breath warm and grassy, and he took time to remove her saddle and bridle before filling her manger with hay. The mare began eating with steady concentration, and Oswald brushed her coat until the dust of travel had been smoothed away. When he returned to the mill, William was inside, running his hands over the machinery with the careful attention of someone reading a beloved book. The older man's fingers traced the wooden gears, testing for looseness or wear, and his expression showed deep contentment as he found everything in proper order. "You have kept good watch," William said, turning to face Oswald. "The stones are well tended, and I see you have already begun the barley for Edmund's wife." They worked together through the morning, falling into the comfortable rhythm of master and apprentice who had shared these tasks for 3 years. William's movements were slower than Oswald's but more efficient, each gesture stripped of unnecessary motion. The older man's gnarled hands adjusted mechanisms with the sureness of long knowledge, and Oswald watched carefully, still learning despite his growing competence. Margaret appeared at mid-morning with bread and ale, her capable hands steady as she set the meal on the bench. Her graying auburn hair caught the light from the doorway, and she smiled to see her husband return. The 3 of them ate together, and William spoke of Canterbury, the crowds in the market square, the merchants arguing over prices, the cathedral bells that rang the hours with voices deep as distant thunder. "The city holds wonders," William said, tearing bread with his gnarled hands, "but I am always glad to return to the river's voice and the wheels turning. There is a peace here that cities cannot offer, no matter how grand their buildings or how full their markets." Oswald understood this sentiment completely. He had traveled to Canterbury once, years ago, and remembered the overwhelming rush of people and noise, the way the streets seemed to press in from all sides. The mill, with its patient rhythms and familiar dimensions, suited him far better than any city could. After the meal, William suggested they walk the mill race to check for debris or damage. They followed the channel that diverted water from the river to the wheel, their feet finding purchase on the muddy banks. Leaves had accumulated in places, and they cleared these with long wooden rakes, watching the water flow more freely once the obstructions were removed. The work took them away from the mill's immediate surroundings, deeper into the willows that lined the watercourse. Sunlight filtered through branches already beginning to show touches of yellow and gold. A kingfisher flashed past, a streak of blue and orange that disappeared into shadows downstream. The air smelled of water and earth, of plants beginning their slow descent toward winter's dormancy. "The wheel will need new paddles before spring," William observed, pausing to study where water struck wood. 3 on the lower quarter are showing splits. We will shape them during the winter months when milling slows and we have time for such work." Oswald nodded, making note of this in his mind. Winter work had its own rhythms, repairs and maintenance, preparation for the busier seasons when harvest demanded constant milling. He looked forward to those quieter months, to working beside William in the mill while snow fell outside and the river flowed dark between white banks. They returned to find a monk waiting near the mill door. Brother Anselm, 46 years old, with ink-stained fingers and thoughtful gray eyes, had come from the abbey with grain for milling and manuscripts to discuss with William. The older miller greeted the monk with genuine pleasure, and they settled on the bench while Oswald began processing the abbey's wheat. The two older men spoke of books and prayers, of the abbey's scriptorium and the slow work of copying texts. Brother Anselm's voice held the measured cadence of someone accustomed to reading aloud, and even his ordinary speech seemed touched by the rhythms of psalms and scripture. Oswald listened while working, finding their conversation soothing despite not always understanding the theological points they debated. "The new prior wishes to expand our library," Brother Anselm said. "He believes knowledge should be preserved and shared, not hoarded like misers with gold. We are copying medical texts now, herbals and treatises on healing. Perhaps such knowledge will serve the surrounding villages as much as our prayers do." William nodded, his expression approving. Knowledge that eases suffering is as valuable as bread that eases hunger. Both are gifts to be shared. The afternoon passed in this manner. Work and conversation intermingled, the mill's voice providing a constant background to human speech. Oswald filled sacks with flour ground from the abbey's grain, each one destined for the communion bread that would be consecrated at Mass. The thought added a different quality to his work, knowing these hands would eventually touch something sacred. By the time Brother Anselm departed, the sun had traveled well past its highest point. The monk blessed them both before leaving, making the sign of the cross in the air with his ink-stained fingers. Oswald watched him disappear along the path toward the abbey, his dark robes blending with the shadows under the trees. The evening brought cooler air, and the first hints of mist began to form above the river. Oswald and William worked side by side to bank the millstones and secure the building for the night. The wheel would continue turning through the darkness, but the interior work was done until morning returned. They moved through these tasks with the ease of people who had performed them countless times, each knowing what the other would do without need for words. Margaret called them to supper at the cottage, and they crossed the yard as twilight deepened overhead. The cottage interior glowed with firelight, and the table was set with wooden bowls and spoons. A pot of stew hung over the fire, rich with the scent of turnips and barley, onions and herbs. Fresh bread waited on a board, and Margaret poured ale into cups as the men settled onto benches. The meal unfolded with comfortable conversation, William sharing more details of his Canterbury journey, Margaret recounting the village news Oswald had missed while his master was away. Someone's cow had birthed twin calves. The Reeves' daughter would marry in the spring. Thatcher had begun repairs on the church roof, work that would continue through autumn until the first hard frosts made such labor impossible. Oswald ate slowly, savoring the stew's warmth and the bread's substantial texture. The fire crackled on the hearth, and shadows danced across the walls. This gathering felt complete in a way that solitary meals could not. 3 people joined by work and affection, sharing food and company as darkness settled around the cottage like a sheltering cloak. When the meal concluded, Oswald helped Margaret clear the table, carrying bowls to the basin for washing. Through the cottage window, stars were beginning to appear, scattered across the deepening blue like seeds broadcast across a field. The evening star shone brightest, low on the western horizon, and Oswald paused to observe its steady light. He returned to the mill as full night arrived, carrying a tall candle Margaret had given him. The flame wavered as he walked, casting moving shadows that stretched and shrank with each step. Inside the mill, he climbed to the loft and set the candle on the shelf beside his mattress. The small light pushed back darkness enough to undress and settle beneath his wool blanket. Through the window, the night sky displayed its vastness. Oswald could hear the wheels splash, constant as his own heartbeat, and beneath that sound the river's deeper voice. An owl called from the willows, its cry both eerie and beautiful, and another answered from farther away. The night held its own community, creatures pursuing their purposes while humans slept. Oswald's eyes grew heavy, and he let them close. The day's work settled into his muscles as pleasant tiredness, and his mind drifted through images of stone and water, grain and flower, the endless patient turning that defined his days. Sleep approached like the river's current, gentle, irresistible, carrying him toward rest as surely as water carried leaves toward the distant sea. The next morning arrived overcast, with clouds the color of old pewter stretched across the sky. Oswald woke to diffused light and air that promised rain before day's end. He dressed and descended to the mill, where William was already working, his gnarled hands adjusting the grain flow to the stones. "We will work indoors today," William said without preamble. "The weather suits itself to our purposes. There is sharpening to be done, and I would teach you the proper angles for millstone dressing." Oswald felt a stirring of interest. Dressing the stones, cutting new furrows into their surfaces when the old ones wore smooth, was skilled work that required both strength and precision. William had shown him the basics before, but today's lesson promised deeper instruction. They began by carefully disengaging the upper stone from its spindle, a process requiring patience and attention to avoid damage. The stone was massive, far heavier than it appeared, and they used wooden levers to lift and shift it aside. Beneath, the lower stone sat in its bed, its surface visible now in the light from the doorway. William produced a set of tools, hammers with specially shaped heads, chisels of varying sizes, and a wooden template marked with the pattern of furrows to be cut. He settled onto a low stool beside the stone, and Oswald crouched nearby, watching as his master began to explain. "The furrows must radiate from the center like the spokes of a wheel," William said, tracing the pattern with one gnarled finger. "Each cut follows the stone's natural grain, encouraging it to break cleanly rather than shatter. The depth must be consistent, the angles precise. Too shallow and the grain will not grind properly. Too deep, and you weaken the stone itself." He demonstrated, setting the chisel to stone and striking with the hammer. The sound rang clear and sharp, and a thin line of dust appeared where metal met rock. William worked methodically, his movements economical, and Oswald watched the furrow deepen with each controlled blow. After watching William work through several furrows, Oswald was given the hammer and chisel to attempt the task himself. The tools felt heavier than he expected, and his first strikes were tentative, producing barely visible marks on the stone's surface. William's gnarled hands guided him, adjusting the angle slightly, showing him how to let the hammer's weight do the work rather than forcing each blow. "Find the rhythm," William said, his voice mild and patient. "The stone will tell you when the angle is correct. You will feel it through the tools, hear it in the sound each strike makes. Oswald tried again, and this time the chisel bit more deeply. He struck again, then again, falling into a pattern that felt less awkward with each repetition. His flour-dusted hands gripped the tools with growing confidence, and the furrow began to deepen in a clean, straight line. Sweat gathered on his forehead despite the cool air, and he paused to wipe it away with his sleeve. "Good," William said, nodding his approval. "You have the patience this work requires. Many apprentices rush, trying to finish quickly, and they ruin good stones with their haste. You understand that some tasks cannot be hurried." They worked through the morning, alternating between instruction and practice. The mill filled with the sound of hammer on chisel, metal on stone, a rhythmic percussion that joined with the wheels turning outside. Rain began falling around midday, a steady autumn rain that darkened the sky and filled the air with the scent of wet earth and stone. Margaret brought their midday meal to the mill rather than calling them to the cottage, understanding that the work underway should not be interrupted unnecessarily. She set down a basket containing bread, cheese, cold mutton, and apples, along with a jug of ale. The three of them ate while rain drummed on the mill's roof, a soothing sound that made the interior feel even more sheltered and secure. "The river will rise tonight," William observed, looking toward the doorway where rain fell in silver sheets. "Nothing to concern us. Autumn rains are gentle compared to spring floods. But the wheel will turn faster, and we must check the race tomorrow to ensure no debris has washed down." Oswald nodded, mentally adding this task to the ones already planned. The river's moods were as familiar to him as the seasons themselves, the spring surges that brought branches and sometimes whole trees, the summer lows when the wheel turned more slowly, the autumn steadiness, the winter ice that occasionally required breaking away from the paddles. Each season brought its own demands and rewards. After the meal, they returned to the millstone. Oswald's arms ached from the unfamiliar work, but it was a good ache, the kind that spoke of new skills being learned. His sandy brown hair fell across his forehead as he bent to his task, and he hummed plain-chant melodies while working, the music helping him maintain the steady rhythm William had taught him. By late afternoon, when the rain had softened to drizzle and the clouds showed hints of lighter gray, they had completed one quadrant of the stone. William examined their work carefully, running his gnarled fingers along each furrow, testing depth and angle. His expression showed satisfaction, and he straightened with a slight groan that spoke of knees held bent too long. "We will finish the rest over the coming weeks," he said. "There is no urgency. The stones will serve well enough for another month before the new furrows become necessary. But you have learned the fundamentals today, and that is worth more than completing the task quickly." They replaced the upper stone carefully, using the levers to position it precisely on its spindle. The work required concentration and coordination, but they had performed it together enough times that their movements matched without need for constant discussion. When the stone was secured, William engaged the mechanism, and the grinding voice resumed, filling the mill with its familiar rumble. Oswald swept stone dust from the floor, gathering it carefully. Even this powder had uses, mixed with water for cleaning or spread in garden paths to discourage certain insects. His broom whispered across the boards, and he worked his way from the center of the mill outward, pushing the dust toward the door where rain had already begun to wash it into the earth. The evening arrived early under the overcast sky. William returned to the cottage, but Oswald remained in the mill, drawn to complete one final task before darkness made work impossible. He climbed to the loft and retrieved a piece of cloth he had been using to polish the smaller brass fittings throughout the mill: handles, latches, the decorative plates that covered joints in the machinery. He worked by the last gray light filtering through the doorway, rubbing each piece until it gleamed. The brass was cool beneath his touch, and the cloth grew dark with tarnish as he worked. This was detailed work, unnecessary for the mill's function but satisfying in its own right. His master had taught him that a well-kept mill was more than functional machinery. It was a statement of pride and care, a visible sign that the miller honored his craft. As he worked, a memory surfaced of his first days at the mill 3 years past. He had been 14 then, gangly and uncertain, sent by his father to learn a trade. The mill had seemed impossibly complex, its mechanisms mysterious and intimidating. William had been patient, showing him first the simplest tasks: sweeping, carrying sacks, fetching water, before gradually introducing him to the mill's deeper workings. Oswald remembered the first time William had allowed him to engage the stones alone, the flutter of nervousness in his chest as he pulled the lever. The grinding had begun, and nothing had broken, and William's gnarled hand had clasped his shoulder in approval. That moment had marked a turning point, the beginning of true competence rather than merely following instructions. Now, 3 years later, he could manage the mill alone for days at a time. The knowledge brought the deep contentment that always came when he reflected on his place here, not the sharp joy of sudden happiness, but the quieter satisfaction of belonging, of purpose fulfilled through daily work. Full darkness had fallen by the time Oswald finished polishing. He climbed down from the loft and secured the mill for the night, checking each door and shutter. The rain had stopped, leaving the air fresh and cool, scented with wet earth and the river's mineral smell. Stars appeared between breaking clouds, and the wheel's splash seemed louder in the night's stillness. He crossed the yard to the cottage, where a firelight glowed through the windows. Inside, William sat near the hearth, mending a leather harness strap, while Margaret worked at her spinning wheel. The wool she spun was undyed, the natural cream color of the sheep it came from, and the wheels turning added another rhythm to the evening's peaceful sounds. "Sit with us a while," Margaret said, gesturing to an empty stool. "There is ale in the jug and bread if you are hungry." Oswald poured himself a cup and settled onto the stool, stretching his legs toward the fire's warmth. The day's work had tired him pleasantly, and he felt no need to speak, content simply to share space with these two people who had become like family. William hummed tunelessly while working the leather, and Margaret's wheel turned with its soft whooshing sound, and the fire crackled and settled. Time passed unmeasured, marked only by the fire burning lower and the wool on Margaret's spindle growing into a larger skein. Eventually, William set aside his mending and announced his intention to sleep. Margaret banked the fire, covering the coals with ash to preserve them through the night, and Oswald took this as his signal to return to the mill. The night air was cold now, sharp with autumn's advance. Oswald crossed the yard quickly, his breath visible in the darkness. Inside the mill, he climbed to the loft without bothering to light a candle, knowing the space well enough to navigate by feel. His mattress received him, and he pulled the wool blanket up to his chin, savoring its warmth. Through the window, the stars were fully visible now, bright and numerous. Oswald picked out the few constellations he knew: the Plough, the Hunter, the Great Bear. Their names came from stories older than memory, patterns imposed on chaos by human need to find order in vastness. He wondered if the stars themselves were aware of being observed, if they cared that earthbound creatures traced lines between them and called those lines meaningful. The thought drifted away as sleep approached. His body relaxed by degrees, the day's aches softening into comfort. The wheel turned outside and the river flowed, and somewhere an animal called in the darkness. A fox perhaps, or a night bird. Oswald's breathing slowed and deepened, matching the rhythm of water and wheel, and consciousness faded like mist beneath the morning sun. Morning returned with clear skies and air so crisp it seemed to ring like struck glass. Oswald woke to brilliant light pouring through the window, and he rose quickly, eager to greet such a day. He dressed and descended to find the mill transformed by autumn's advance. Frost silvered every surface outside, and his breath plumed white in the cold air. The river flowed smooth and dark, steam rising from its surface where warmer water met cold air. The willows wore frost like a delicate white garment, each branch outlined in crystals that caught the early light. Oswald stood in the doorway, simply observing this beauty, feeling gratitude rise in his chest for the privilege of witnessing such mornings. William appeared from the cottage, moving carefully on ground made slippery by frost. His gnarled hands were tucked into his sleeves for warmth, and his breath clouded around his bearded face. Together, they inspected the mill race as planned, walking its length to check for debris washed down by yesterday's rain. They found branches lodged against the wheel in 2 places, and these they worked loose with long poles, letting the current carry them away downstream. The wheel's paddles showed no damage, and the race flowed clear and strong. The river had risen slightly, as William predicted, and the wheel turned faster, its splash more vigorous than usual. "Winter approaches," William observed, studying the cleared sky. "We will have 2 more months of good milling weather, perhaps 3 if the season is kind. Then the slow months when we maintain and repair and wait for spring to bring new work." They returned to the mill as the sun climbed higher, burning away the frost and warming the air. Oswald filled the hopper with barley from Edmund's delivery, adjusting the stones to grind finer than usual as requested. The barley had a different character than wheat, denser, more resistant to the stone's pressure, and he monitored the grinding carefully to ensure the proper texture. By mid-morning, farmers began arriving with grain for milling, a steady stream of carts and sacks that spoke of harvest's final stages. William greeted each one, discussing prices and schedules, while Oswald managed the actual milling. The work fell into a comfortable pattern: receive grain, mill it, fill sacks, stack them for collection, each step familiar yet requiring attention. A young boy arrived with his father, perhaps 6 years old, with wide, curious eyes that took in every detail of the mill. The child watched the stones turn with fascination, and Oswald found himself explaining the process in simple terms, showing how grain entered the hopper and emerged as flour. The boy's questions were endless. Where did the power come from? Why did the stones not break? How did you know when the flour was ready? And Oswald answered each one with patience, remembering his own early curiosity. The boy's father, a farmer named Godric with sun-darkened skin and calloused hands, smiled at his son's enthusiasm. "He has been asking to visit the mill for weeks," Godric said, his voice carrying the rough warmth of someone who spent his days outdoors. "I told him when the barley was harvested, we would make the journey together." Oswald crouched beside the child, bringing himself to the boy's height. "Would you like to feel the flour?" he asked, scooping a handful from the collection trough. The boy nodded eagerly, and Oswald placed the pale powder in his small palm. "See how soft it is. Your mother will make bread from this, and when you eat that bread, you will remember watching it being made." The child's fingers closed around the flour, then opened again to watch it drift away like snow. His expression held such pure delight that Oswald felt his own mood lift further. There was something precious in witnessing another person's first experience of the mill, seeing it fresh through eyes unclouded by familiarity. When Godric and his son departed, the boy waved until the cart rounded the bend and disappeared from sight. Oswald returned to his work, but the encounter stayed with him, adding brightness to an already clear day. He hummed plain-chant melodies while pouring more barley into the hopper, the music flowing as naturally as the river outside. The afternoon brought a lull in visitors, and William suggested they walk to the village to purchase supplies. They secured the mill and set out together along the river path, their boots crunching on fallen leaves that had dried since yesterday's rain. The air held autumn's particular scent. Decay and ripeness mingled, the earth preparing for winter's rest. In the village, they stopped first at the blacksmith's forge. The smith, a broad man named Cuthbert with arms thick as young trees, was hammering at his anvil, shaping what appeared to be a new hinge. The forge's heat rolled out in waves, welcome after the walk's coolness, and the ringing of hammer on metal filled the space with purposeful sound. "William," Cuthbert called, setting aside his work, "I have those nails you requested, 4 dozen as we agreed." While William examined the nails and discussed payment, Oswald watched the forge fire, mesmerized by its shifting colors, deep orange at the center, yellow at the edges, occasional blue flames dancing where metal heated. The blacksmith's work shared something with milling, he realized. Both involved transformation, taking raw material and changing it into something more useful, more refined. Their next stop was the chandler's shop, where they purchased tallow candles for the coming darker months. The shop smelled of rendered fat and beeswax, and the chandler's wife wrapped their purchase in clean cloth while recounting news of her daughter's new baby, born healthy just 3 days past. As they walked through the village, Oswald noticed preparations for the harvest festival beginning to take shape. Men were constructing a platform near the church for musicians, and women were cleaning the common hall where the feast would be held. The festival was still 2 weeks away, but already anticipated colored conversations, people discussing what dishes they would bring and which dances they hoped to perform. "Will you attend this year?" William asked as they passed the common hall. Oswald nodded. "If the mill can be left unattended for an evening." "The mill has stood for 3 generations," William said, his tone mild but certain. "It will survive one night without constant watching. You are young, Oswald. You should dance and eat and celebrate with others your age. Work is important, but so is joy." They returned to the mill as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The river reflected these colors, its surface like molten metal, and the wheels turning sent up spray that caught the light and scattered it into brief rainbows. Margaret had prepared an evening meal and they ate together as twilight deepened. The food was simple but satisfying. A thick pottage of peas and onions, bread spread with butter, apples stored from earlier harvest. Conversation flowed easily, touching on village news, the mill's work, plans for winter repairs. After the meal, Oswald helped Margaret clear the table, then excused himself to return to the mill. The night was clear and cold, promising frost again by morning. Stars were already visible, brilliant against the darkening blue, and the moon rose full and golden above the eastern trees. In the loft, Oswald lit a candle and settled onto his mattress, but sleep seemed distant despite the day's work. Restlessness moved through him, not unpleasant but present nonetheless. He rose and moved to the window, looking out at the moonlit landscape. The mill yard was transformed by silvery light. Shadows pooled beneath the willows, and the river's surface gleamed like polished metal. The wheel turned, its motion visible now as darker shapes moving through brightness, and the splash it made seemed louder in the night's stillness. Everything felt suspended, caught between day and night, between autumn and winter, between the person he had been and the person he was becoming. Oswald was 17 years old, with flour-dusted hands and sandy brown hair that never quite stayed orderly. He had been apprenticed for 3 years, learning patience and skill, discovering satisfaction in work well done. But sometimes, like tonight, he felt the stirring of something unnamed, a reaching toward something he could not quite define, a sense that the world held more than he had yet experienced. The feeling was not discontent. His life at the mill brought him deep contentment, and he could imagine no other work that would suit him better. But beneath that contentment lay curiosity, wonder at what lay beyond the village boundaries, what stories moved through the wider world while he ground grain and tended stones. He watched the moon climb higher, its light growing whiter and colder. An owl called from somewhere in the willows and another answered. Their voices seemed to speak of mysteries, of knowledge held by creatures who moved through darkness with ease. Oswald listened until the calls faded, then returned to his mattress. Sleep came eventually, carrying him into dreams of rivers and roads, of wheels turning and paths unwinding. He dreamed of walking beside water that flowed upward like rain falling in reverse, of stones that sang instead of grinding, of bread that rose from the earth like flowers. The dreams made no logical sense but held their own truth, the kind that lived in symbol rather than fact. Morning arrived with clouds building from the west, gray and heavy with promised rain. Oswald woke up feeling the shift in weather through the air's pressure, a skill learned from 3 years of close attention to the world's moods. He dressed quickly and descended to begin the day's work, finding William already at the mill, checking the grain inventory. "We are low on wheat," William observed, running his gnarled hand through one of the remaining sacks. "I will visit the Abbey today and discuss their next delivery. You can manage here." Oswald assured him he could, and William departed after breaking his fast. The mill settled into its working rhythm, and Oswald moved through his tasks with the efficiency of long practice. More farmers arrived with late harvest grain, and he received each delivery, recording amounts in the ledger William kept, promising completion dates that he knew he could meet. By midday, rain had begun, not the gentle drizzle of days past, but a steady downpour that drummed on the mill's roof and turned the yard to mud. The river's voice grew louder, and Oswald kept close watch on its rising level, knowing that too much rain could force them to partially close the mill race to protect the wheel from excessive force. A figure appeared through the rain's gray curtain, Brother Anselm from the Abbey, his dark robes soaked despite a heavy cloak. The monk's ink-stained fingers clutched a leather satchel to his chest, protecting its contents from the weather. Oswald welcomed him inside quickly, helping him remove his dripping cloak and hang it where the mill's relative warmth might dry it. "Forgive the unannounced visit," Brother Anselm said, water dripping from his thoughtful gray eyes. "I passed William on the road and he mentioned you were alone today. I thought you might welcome company, and I have manuscripts to review that require only quiet and decent light." Oswald was indeed glad for the company. He settled Brother Anselm on the bench near the best light from the doorway, then returned to his work. The monk spread his manuscripts carefully, and soon both men were absorbed in their respective tasks, Oswald with grain and flour, Brother Anselm with parchment and text. The afternoon passed in companionable silence, broken only by the mill's grinding voice and the rain's percussion. Occasionally, Brother Anselm would read a passage aloud, seemingly to himself, but loud enough for Oswald to hear. The words were in Latin, which Oswald understood only partially, but their rhythm was soothing, adding another layer to the mill's music. "This is from a herb," Brother Anselm explained during one such reading. "It describes the proper harvesting of feverfew and the preparation of tinctures for headache and women's complaints. The knowledge comes from the Greeks originally, passed through Arab scholars, now being copied into our own libraries." Oswald found this fascinating, the idea that knowledge could travel such distances, crossing languages and centuries, preserved by patient scribes working in quiet rooms. His own work was more immediate, more physical, but he recognized kinship in the dedication required. Both miller and scribe served their communities by preserving and transforming. One worked with grain, the other with words, but both required patience and precision. The rain continued through the afternoon, showing no sign of diminishing. William returned near evening, equally soaked, reporting that the Abbey's grain delivery would arrive in 3 days. He greeted Brother Anselm warmly, and the 3 men shared bread and cheese that William had brought from the cottage. "You should stay the night," William told the monk, gesturing at the rain still falling heavily. "The road to the abbey will be treacherous in this weather, and we have space in the loft where Oswald sleeps. He will not mind sharing his quarters for one evening." Brother Anselm accepted gratefully, and as darkness fell, the three of them made their way to the loft. The monk carried his manuscripts wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, and Oswald helped him arrange a sleeping space using extra blankets Margaret had provided. The loft felt crowded with 3 occupants, but not unpleasantly so. Rather, it held a sense of shelter strengthened by shared company. They settled in as rain continued its drumming overhead. William fell asleep quickly, his breathing deepening into soft snores. Brother Anselm lay quietly, perhaps praying, his lips moving silently in the darkness. Oswald found himself more wakeful than usual, aware of the other's presence, the storm outside, the wheels faithful turning despite wind and rain. Eventually, sleep claimed him, pulling him down through layers of awareness until the rain became distant and dreamless rest took hold. When morning arrived, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and glistening. Oswald woke to find Brother Anselm already awake, sitting near the window with his manuscript spread across his lap, reading by the early light. William stirred and rose, stretching with the careful movements of someone whose joints protested the cold. The 3 men descended from the loft together, and Margaret appeared shortly after with warm porridge sweetened with honey, steam rising from the wooden bowls she carried. They ate in the mill's doorway, watching mist rise from the river in shifting veils. The water had risen considerably overnight, flowing swift and brown with silt from upstream fields. The wheel turned faster than usual, its voice deeper, more urgent, though still controlled and purposeful. "The race will need checking," William said, setting down his empty bowl. "Debris always comes with the heavy rains." Brother Anselm departed after the meal, his manuscripts secure in their leather satchel, his robes dried enough for the walk back to the abbey. He blessed them both before leaving, and Oswald watched the monk's dark figure grow smaller along the path until the willows obscured him completely. The day that followed brought steady work. Oswald and William walked the mill race together, removing branches and accumulated leaves, checking the stone walls that channeled water toward the wheel. The ground squelched beneath their boots, and their hands grew muddy from the work, but the task was necessary and neither complained. By afternoon, they had cleared the race and verified the wheel's paddles remained intact despite the storm's force. The river had already begun to recede, dropping perceptibly even as they worked. William explained how to read the water's moods through subtle signs, the color of the current, the sound it made against the banks, the speed at which floating debris moved. "The river is our partner," William said, his gnarled hands gesturing toward the flowing water. "We must learn its language, respect its power. It gives us everything we need to work. We owe it careful attention in return." Oswald absorbed this teaching, adding it to the accumulated wisdom William had shared over 3 years. His master rarely spoke at length, preferring to demonstrate rather than explain. But when he did offer words, they carried weight earned through decades of experience. The following days settled into familiar patterns. Grain arrived, was milled, and departed as flour. The wheel turned ceaselessly, and the stones ground with their steady voice. Autumn advanced. The willow's remaining leaves turned gold and began to fall. Mornings grew colder, and the angle of sunlight changed, becoming more slanted, less warm. The harvest festival approached, and preparations in the village intensified. Oswald found himself thinking about it more frequently, remembering William's encouragement to attend. He had gone to previous festivals, but always briefly, staying on the edges, reluctant to leave the mill unattended for long. This year, something in him wanted to participate more fully, to join the dancing and feasting, to be part of the community's celebration rather than merely an observer. 2 days before the festival, Margaret appeared at the mill with an armful of fabric, a new tunic she had sewn for Oswald. The cloth was good wool, dyed a deep blue that reminded him of twilight skis. She insisted he try it on, and when he did, he found it fit perfectly, the sleeves falling to his wrists, the hem reaching past his hips. "You cannot attend a festival in your work clothes," Margaret said, her capable hands smoothing wrinkles from the fabric. Her graying auburn hair was braided simply, and her expression held maternal satisfaction. Every young person deserves at least one garment that makes them feel presentable. Oswald thanked her, moved by the gift's generosity. The tunic represented hours of spinning, weaving, cutting, and stitching, labor given freely out of affection. He folded it carefully and carried it to the loft, placing it on the shelf where it would stay clean until the festival arrived. The day before the celebration, William declared the mill would close early. They completed only the most necessary work, then spent the afternoon on small maintenance tasks that could be interrupted easily. The mood felt lighter somehow, as though even the mill itself anticipated the coming break from routine. That evening, Oswald bathed in the river despite the water's coldness, scrubbing away accumulated flour dust with sand from the bank. The shock of cold water left his skin tingling and his sandy brown hair dripping, but he felt renewed, prepared for the next day's festivities. He returned to the loft and carefully trimmed his hair with his eating knife, working by candlelight, trying to make himself more presentable. Sleep came slowly that night, excitement keeping him wakeful longer than usual. Through the window, stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and the wheel turned below, faithful as breathing. Oswald lay listening to these familiar sounds, feeling suspended between anticipation and contentment, grateful for his daily life while curious about the celebration tomorrow would bring. Morning arrived clear and cool, perfect weather for a festival. Oswald rose early despite the shorter sleep and dressed carefully in his new tunic. The blue wool felt different against his skin than his work clothes, smoother, less worn, carrying the faint scent of the herbs Margaret used to keep moths away. William and Margaret were already preparing for the day when Oswald emerged from the mill. Margaret wore her best dress, deep green with yellow embroidery at the neck and sleeves, and William had donned a tunic Oswald had never seen before, brown wool with leather trim. They made a handsome couple, Oswald thought, people who carried their years with grace. The three of them walked to the village together as the sun climbed higher. Other families were converging on the common from various directions, everyone dressed in their finest clothes, carrying baskets of food to contribute to the feast. Children ran ahead of their parents, already excited, their voices bright with anticipation. The common had been transformed. Long tables stood in rows, already beginning to fill with food, roasted meats, fresh bread, wheels of cheese, pies both sweet and savory, barrels of ale and cider. The platform near the church held musicians tuning their instruments, and the space before it had been cleared for dancing. Everywhere Oswald looked, he saw color and movement, heard laughter and conversation. Margaret guided them to the tables and found space for the basket she had brought, a large meat pie, still warm, its crust golden and perfect. Other women greeted her, and soon she was absorbed in conversation, leaving William and Oswald to navigate the gathering on their own. "Go," William said, gesturing toward a group of young people gathering near the musicians' platform. "You know most of them from the village. I will find the other elders and share stories of harvests past. This is your time to enjoy, not to stand beside an old man." Oswald hesitated only briefly before moving toward the younger crowd. He recognized most of them: the baker's daughter Alice, the blacksmith's son Robert, several farmers' children he had seen at the mill over the years. They welcomed him easily, making space in their circle, and soon he found himself caught up in their energy and good spirits. The festival began officially when the priest emerged from the church and offered a blessing over the gathered crowd. His words thanked God for the harvest's abundance, for community and health, for the turning of seasons that brought both challenge and plenty. Everyone bowed their heads during the prayer, and when it concluded, a cheer rose from the assembled villagers. The feast commenced. People filled wooden plates from the laden tables, finding seats on benches or settling on blankets spread across the grass. Oswald ate with the other young people, savoring flavors he rarely encountered: roasted pork with crackling skin, honeyed parsnips, a custard tart that melted on his tongue. Alice, 19 years old with red hair and a quick laugh, sat beside him, and they talked easily about small things: the weather, the harvest, her father's plans to expand his ovens. When the eating slowed and people's appetites were satisfied, the musicians began to play. The music started with a slow melody, something traditional and familiar, and gradually built in tempo. Soon couples were moving onto the cleared space, forming lines for a dance Oswald recognized from previous festivals. Alice stood and extended her hand. "Will you dance?" Oswald's immediate instinct was to decline. He felt clumsy at dancing, uncertain of the steps, but something in the day's brightness, in Alice's open smile, made him accept. They joined the lines and the dance began. The movements were simple enough to follow: steps forward and back, turns in place, hands joining and releasing. Oswald concentrated on watching others and matching their movements, and gradually his self-consciousness faded. The music carried him forward, and Alice's presence beside him was easy and undemanding. When he made mistakes, she simply laughed and guided him gently back into the pattern. The dance concluded, and another began immediately, faster and more complex. Oswald begged off this one, retreating to the sidelines to catch his breath and watch. His heart beat pleasantly fast from the exertion, and his face felt warm despite the autumn air's coolness. Alice remained in the dancing, partnering with Robert now, her red hair swinging as she spun. Oswald found a place to sit on a low stone wall that bordered the common, watching the celebration unfold before him. The musicians played with evident joy, their instruments blending, fiddle, pipe, and drum creating melodies that seemed to lift the dancers' feet without conscious effort. Children wove between the adults, playing games of their own invention, their laughter adding brightness to the music. William appeared beside him, settling onto the wall with a contented sigh. His gnarled hands held a cup of ale, and his bearded face showed the relaxation of someone thoroughly at ease. "You danced," he observed, his tone approving. "Margaret will be pleased when I tell her." "It was less difficult than I expected," Oswald admitted, watching the swirling patterns of dancers. "Though I suspect Alice made it easier by being a patient partner." "Alice is a good young woman," William said. "Her father speaks highly of her skill with baking, and she has a kind disposition. Such qualities matter more than beauty, though she has that as well." Oswald nodded, uncertain how to respond to what felt like gentle encouragement toward something undefined. He liked Alice well enough. Her easy manner and quick laughter made her pleasant company, but his thoughts had not extended beyond simple friendship. Perhaps they should, he thought. Perhaps this was another aspect of growing into adulthood he had not yet considered fully. The afternoon progressed in waves of activity and rest. More dances followed, some traditional and others improvised by the musicians who seemed to be enjoying themselves as much as anyone. Food continued to appear from baskets that seemed bottomless, and ale flowed freely. Oswald danced twice more, once with Alice again, and once with Margaret, who proved surprisingly light on her feet despite her years. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, the mood of the gathering shifted from energetic to mellow. People settled into smaller groups, talking quietly, while children who had run themselves to exhaustion dozed on blankets in their parents' laps. The musicians played softer melodies now, songs that spoke of endings and contentment rather than celebration's peak. Oswald found himself walking the edge of the common, needing a moment of quiet after the day's stimulation. He moved toward the church and sat on the stone steps leading to its door, looking back at the scene before him. The village gathered together, every family represented, sharing food and music and time. This was a community, he realized, not just living near each other, but choosing to come together, to celebrate and support and simply be present in each other's lives. Alice appeared carrying 2 cups of cider. She climbed the steps and sat beside him, offering 1 cup. "You looked contemplative," she said. "Thought you might appreciate something cool to drink." He accepted gratefully, the cider sweet and slightly tart against his tongue. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the gathering together. The light had turned golden, that particular autumn quality that made everything seem both vivid and gentle simultaneously. "Do you ever think about leaving the village?" Alice asked eventually, her voice quiet. "Going to see what lies beyond the fields and forests?" The question surprised Oswald, mirroring thoughts he had experienced but rarely voiced. "Sometimes," he admitted, Though I cannot imagine leaving the mill permanently, it has become part of who I am." "I understand that," Alice said, nodding. "I feel the same about my father's ovens, but sometimes I wonder what the great cities are like, or the sea. My grandmother saw the sea once when she was young. She said it was like the sky had fallen to earth, endless and blue." They talked as the light faded, sharing quiet thoughts about dreams and contentment, about the tension between wanting more and being grateful for what already existed. Alice spoke of hoping to expand her father's business someday, perhaps opening a second bakery in a neighboring village. Oswald found himself describing his fascination with the mill's mechanisms, how he wanted to understand not just how to operate them, but why they worked, what principles of weight and force and motion made the transformation of grain possible. When full darkness arrived and the first stars appeared, the festival began to wind down. Families gathered their belongings, and people called goodbyes across the common. The musicians packed their instruments, and village men began clearing tables and benches. The priest emerged to offer a final blessing, thanking everyone for coming together in fellowship. Oswald helped with the cleanup, carrying benches back to the common hall, stacking plates for washing. William and Margaret worked nearby, and gradually the common returned to its usual state, empty grass under starlight, the platform standing bare and quiet. The transformation from celebration back to ordinary space happened quickly, as though the festival had been a dream that faded upon waking. The walk back to the mill felt longer than the morning's journey, tiredness making Oswald's legs heavy. But it was pleasant tiredness, the kind that comes from a day fully lived. Margaret hummed as they walked, and William's gnarled hand rested on her shoulder. Oswald followed slightly behind, giving them privacy while staying close enough to share the walk. At the cottage, Margaret produced leftover pie from her basket and cut generous slices for each of them. They ate standing in the yard, too tired to bother with sitting formally. The pie was even better cold, Oswald thought, the flavors somehow intensified. Above them, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, and the wheel turned as it always did, indifferent to festivals or ordinary days. "Thank you for encouraging me to attend," Oswald said to William, brushing crumbs from his new blue tunic. "It was good to spend time away from work, to remember there is more to life than daily tasks." "There is more," William agreed, "but the daily tasks matter too. Both are necessary, the celebration and the routine, the community and the solitary work. A life needs balance, like a wheel needs its hub and its rim. Neither alone is sufficient." Oswald carried this thought with him to the loft, where he changed back into his work clothes and folded the blue tunic carefully. His body ached pleasantly from dancing, and his mind held images of the day, Alice's smile, the swirling dancers, the golden light on the gathered village. But beneath these recent memories, he felt the deeper pull of the mill's rhythms, the work that awaited tomorrow, the life he had chosen and which had chosen him. Sleep came easily despite the day's excitement. The wheel's splash provided its familiar lullaby, and Oswald drifted into rest with a sense of completeness he had not experienced before. The festival had been wonderful, but returning to the mill felt equally good. Like breathing out after breathing in, both necessary for life to continue. Morning arrived with clouds building again from the west, but these were thin and high, the kind that promised no rain. Oswald woke feeling refreshed, eager to return to work after the previous day's break. He descended to find William already in the mill, checking the grain stores and making notes in his ledger. "The Abbey's delivery arrives today," William reminded him. "We should prepare space in the storage shed." They worked together through the morning, clearing room for the incoming grain, sweeping dust from corners, checking that the shed's roof remained sound and dry. The work was simple but satisfying, putting things in order, creating space for what would come. Oswald hummed plainchant melodies while working, the music as natural as breathing. The Abbey's cart arrived near midday, driven by a lay brother Oswald did not recognize. Behind the first cart came a second, both loaded with sacks of wheat and barley. Brother Anselm accompanied them, his ink-stained fingers holding a wax tablet with quantities noted. "A generous harvest this year," Brother Anselm said as they began unloading. "The prior wishes to increase our stores before winter. We will need much of this milled within the fortnight if you can manage such volume." William assured him they could, and the work of unloading began. Oswald and the lay brother carried sacks, while William and Brother Anselm verified counts. The autumn air held a pleasant coolness that made the physical labor comfortable rather than exhausting. By the time both carts were empty, the storage shed was nearly full, sacks stacked carefully with space between for air circulation. Brother Anselm departed with the empty carts, promising to return in 3 days for the first portion of milled flour. William and Oswald stood in the shed doorway, surveying the work ahead. Weeks of steady milling, careful attention, the transformation of grain into flour that would become bread for the Abbey's tables and for distribution to the poor. "We will need to work longer days," William observed, his tone matter-of-fact rather than concerned. "But the weather is good for it and the work is honest. There are worse ways to spend autumn." They began that afternoon milling steadily until twilight made further work impossible. The rhythm felt good after the festival's break, the stone's grinding voice, the wheel's faithful turning, the accumulation of flour in neat sacks. Oswald's flour-dusted hands moved with practiced efficiency, and his mind settled into the calm focus that work provided. The days that followed blurred together in the best way, each dawn similar to the last, each day's work building toward the larger goal of completing the Abbey's order. The weather was fair, cold but clear, perfect for milling. Frost appeared each morning, silver and delicate, melting away by midday. The river flowed steady and reliable, neither too high nor too low, and the wheel turned with mechanical perfection. William and Oswald worked side by side from dawn until dark, pausing only for meals that Margaret brought to the mill. The older man's gnarled hands moved with undiminished skill despite his years, and Oswald found himself matching William's pace naturally, their movements synchronized through long familiarity. On the third evening, as promised, Brother Anselm returned to collect the first portion of finished flour. 30 sacks waited, stacked neatly near the mill door, and the monk examined them with approval before his assistants loaded them onto the waiting cart. "Excellent work," Brother Anselm said, pressing payment into William's gnarled hand, silver coins that clinked softly in the leather purse. "The prior will be pleased. We will return in 4 days for the next portion." The pattern continued, mill, deliver, mill again. The abbey's order progressed steadily toward completion, and the work settled into Oswald's bones like a familiar song. His 17-year-old body had grown strong from 3 years of this labor, and he found he could lift sacks that once would have strained him, and could work through long days without the exhaustion that had plagued his early apprenticeship. One afternoon, as Oswald poured barley into the hopper, William paused in his work and gestured for attention. "Come here," the older man said, his voice carrying unusual gravity. "There is something I wish to show you." They walked together to where the great millstones sat, their surfaces worn smooth in the centers from years of grinding. William crouched beside the lower stone, running his gnarled fingers along its edge where it met the wooden housing. "Do you see this wear pattern?" he asked, tracing a shallow groove in the wood. Oswald nodded, crouching beside his master to examine the marks more closely. "This tells a story," William continued. "The stone shifts slightly during grinding, so slightly you cannot see it happen, but over months and years it leaves evidence. When this groove deepens beyond a certain point, we must adjust the stone's mounting, or the grinding will become uneven." His thoughtful gray eyes met Oswald's. "I am teaching you this because someday this mill will be yours to tend. Not immediately, I have years left in me yet, but someday. And you must know not just how to operate the mill, but how to read its language, understand its needs before problems arise." The weight of this statement settled over Oswald like a cloak, not burdensome but significant. He had known, in an abstract way, that his apprenticeship would eventually lead to becoming a full miller, perhaps even inheriting William's position. But hearing it stated plainly made the future suddenly real and present. "I will learn everything you can teach me," Oswald said quietly, his flour-dusted hands resting on the stone's cool surface. "I promise to honor the mill as you have taught me." William's bearded face softened into something approaching tenderness. "You already do," he said, rising with a slight grunt. "You have the patience this work requires and the care. Those qualities cannot be taught. Either a person possesses them or they do not. You possess them." They returned to work, but something had shifted. Oswald felt the responsibility more keenly now, saw each task not just as daily labor but as practice for a future role. He watched William more carefully, noting not just what the older man did but why he did it, the reasoning behind each decision. That evening, after the day's work concluded, Oswald climbed to the loft and sat by the window as twilight deepened. The river flowed dark below, and the wheel turned with its eternal patience. He thought about the years ahead, learning, growing in skill, eventually taking William's place as master of this mill. The prospect brought the deep contentment that always filled him when he contemplated his place here, mixed now with a new awareness of time's passage, of the inevitable changes that would come. The next morning brought the first hard frost of the season. Ice edged the river's banks, and the wheel's paddles wore delicate crystal decorations that shattered and reformed with each rotation. Oswald's breath clouded white as he emerged from the loft, and he pulled his cloak tighter against the cold. William was already in the mill, building up the fire in the small hearth they used more for comfort than necessity. The flames crackled and grew, pushing back the morning chill, and Oswald joined his master in warming his hands before beginning work. "Winter approaches faster than usual this year," William observed, holding his gnarled hands toward the fire. "We should complete the Abbey's order before the first snow. After that, the milling will slow, and we can focus on repairs and preparation for spring." They worked with increased purpose that day, milling without pause except for the brief meal Margaret brought at midday. The stones ground steadily, and flour accumulated in the collection troughs. Oswald's movements had become so practiced that his hands worked almost without conscious thought, leaving his mind free to wander through pleasant thoughts, memories of the festival, Alice's easy laughter, the satisfaction of seeing sacks filled with pale flour. Brother Anselm arrived in late afternoon to collect another portion of the order. The monk's ink-stained fingers were reddened with cold, and he accepted William's offer of warm cider gratefully. They stood near the hearth, and Brother Anselm spoke of the Abbey's preparations for winter, salting meat, storing vegetables in the cellars, ensuring sufficient firewood was stacked and dried. "The prior has requested I begin copying a new herbal," Brother Anselm said, his thoughtful gray eyes reflecting firelight. "It contains remedies from the eastern lands brought back by crusaders and traders. The knowledge is precious, plants that ease suffering, techniques for preparing medicines. I will spend much of winter bent over my desk, and my fingers will ache from the cold and the writing, but the work matters." Oswald found himself thinking again about the parallel between their labors, monk and miller, both transforming raw material into something useful, both serving their communities through patient daily work. The comparison pleased him, suggesting that even humble labor held dignity when performed with care. After Brother Anselm departed with his loaded cart, Oswald and William continued milling into the evening. Candles were lit as darkness fell, their flames casting shifting shadows across the mill's interior. The work took on a different quality at night, more intimate somehow. The world narrowed to this space, these tasks, the companionable presence of master and apprentice working side by side. When they finally ceased for the night, Oswald's arms ached pleasantly and his eyes felt heavy. He climbed to the loft and collapsed onto his mattress without bothering to undress fully. Sleep claimed him immediately, deep and dreamless, the kind of rest earned through honest exhaustion. The days blurred together as the Abbey's order neared completion. Frost became a permanent morning feature, and ice thickened along the river's edges. The wheel continued turning, though William watched it carefully, ready to break away ice if it accumulated too heavily on the paddles. So far, the current remained strong enough to prevent serious buildup, but vigilance was necessary. Alice visited the mill one afternoon carrying a basket from her father. Inside were fresh loaves, still warm, their crusts golden and crackling. "Father sent these with his thanks," she said, her red hair tucked beneath a wool hood. "He says your flour produces the finest bread he has ever baked." Oswald invited her inside, grateful for any excuse to pause the relentless milling. They sat on the bench near the hearth, breaking bread and talking easily. Alice spoke of her work, the rhythms of baking that paralleled milling in many ways, the early mornings, the heat and flour, the satisfaction of transformation. "I have been thinking about what we discussed at the festival," Alice said after a while, her voice quiet beneath the stones grinding. "About seeing beyond the village. I have decided I am content here, not because I lack curiosity, but because I have found work that suits me and people I care about. That seems like enough." Oswald nodded, understanding completely. "I feel the same," he said. "The mill has become part of who I am. Leaving would feel like leaving myself behind." Alice smiled and something passed between them. Not quite an agreement, but an understanding, a recognition of shared values. When she departed, Oswald watched her walk away along the frost-bright path, and he felt grateful for her presence in his life, for the gentle friendship that asked nothing but offered much. The final portion of the Abbey's order was completed 3 days later. Brother Anselm arrived with an empty cart and departed with the last sacks of flour, along with William's assurance that they stood ready for the Abbey's next request. The monk blessed them both before leaving, and his parting words carried warmth that went beyond mere business courtesy. "You serve God through your work," Brother Anselm said, his ink-stained fingers making the sign of blessing. "Every loaf of bread that comes from this flour carries your care within it, feeding both body and soul. That is holy work, whether performed in an abbey or a mill." After the cart disappeared along the path, William and Oswald stood in the mill doorway, surveying their domain with satisfaction. The storage shed was nearly empty now, awaiting winter's slower pace. The mill itself was clean and well-maintained, ready for whatever the coming months would bring. "We have done good work," William said simply, his gnarled hand resting briefly on Oswald's shoulder. "Now we rest and prepare and wait for what comes next." That evening, Margaret prepared a feast to celebrate the order's completion: roasted chicken with herbs, turnips mashed with butter, bread pudding sweetened with dried fruit and cream. The three of them ate in the cottage, and conversation flowed easily, touching on memories and plans, gratitude and hope. Oswald returned to the mill as full darkness settled, his belly full and his heart content. He climbed to the loft and settled beneath his wool blanket, listening to the wheel's familiar splash. Through the window, stars burned cold and bright, and the moon had begun to wax again, a silver crescent low in the western sky. He thought about the weeks just past, the festival's joy, the sustained labor of completing the Abbey's order, William's promise that the mill would someday be his to tend. All of it wove together into a pattern he was only beginning to perceive, a life taking shape through daily choices and accumulated moments. Sleep came gradually, carrying him down into rest as the wheel turned and the river flowed. His last waking thought was of morning, of work waiting, of the endless patient rhythm that gave structure and meaning to his days. The mill would be there when he woke, faithful as breathing, and he would tend it with the care it deserved, today and all the tomorrows that would follow. The wheel turned through the night, through all nights, powered by water that had flowed since before memory and would flow long after. Oswald slept, 17 years old with flour-dusted hands and sandy brown hair, an apprentice becoming a master, a boy becoming a man, held safe within the mill's sheltering walls while stars wheeled overhead and the river sang its endless song. Morning arrived with snow falling, the first of the season, small flakes drifting down like white ash from an invisible fire. Oswald woke to change light, softer and diffused, and rose to look through the window. The world had transformed overnight, every surface dusted with white, the willows bowed under their delicate burden. He dressed quickly, his breath visible in the loft's cold air, and descended to find William already stoking the hearth. The older man's gnarled hands fed small sticks to the growing flames, and warmth gradually pushed back the chill. Together, they stood watching the snow fall beyond the doorway, neither speaking, simply observing winter's quiet arrival. "The milling will slow now," William said eventually. "People will come less frequently. They have stored grain through autumn, and winter demands less fresh flour. This is when we turn to other work." True to William's prediction, the days that followed brought fewer visitors. The mill's voice grew quieter as the stones ground less frequently, and the rhythms shifted from constant production to intermittent work punctuated by long periods of maintenance and repair. Oswald found he appreciated this change, the chance to learn aspects of the mill he had not yet mastered. They began with the paddles William had identified as needing replacement. The work required taking the wheel partially out of service, a delicate process that involved redirecting water flow and securing the wheel in place. William showed Oswald how to shape new paddles from seasoned oak, how to measure and cut so they matched the wheel's curve exactly, how to fit and secure them so they would withstand the river's constant pressure. The work took place mostly outdoors, and they dressed warmly against the cold, wool cloaks, leather gloves, hoods that covered their ears. Snow continued falling intermittently, never heavily, but enough to dust their shoulders and collect in their hair. Oswald's fingers grew numb despite the gloves, and they frequently paused to warm their hands at the hearth before returning outside. One afternoon, as they worked on fitting the second paddle, Alice appeared carrying a covered basket. Her red hair was hidden beneath a heavy shawl, and her breath clouded white in the cold air. "My father sent soup," she said, setting the basket on the bench inside the mill. "He thought you might appreciate something warm." The soup was thick with vegetables and barley, rich and nourishing, and they ate it gratefully while Alice sat with them. She spoke of how baking changed in winter. The ovens took longer to heat. Dough rose more slowly in the cold, but the work was pleasant because the heat was welcome rather than oppressive. "I have been practicing new recipes," Alice said, her quick laugh bright in the mill's dimness. "Experimenting with different proportions of flour and water, seeing how they affect the bread's texture. My father says I have a feel for it, that I understand the way some people understand animals or growing things." Oswald recognized this, the same intuition he had developed for the mill, knowing through touch and sound when everything ran properly, when adjustments were needed. Skills that went beyond mere instruction, reaching into something deeper, almost instinctual. After Alice departed, they returned to paddle work. By evening, both new paddles were secured, and they released the wheel back to the river's power. It turned smoothly, the new wood pale against the old, and the splash it made seemed somehow renewed, as though the wheel itself appreciated the attention. The winter days established their own rhythm, slower, more contemplative than the busy seasons. Oswald and William worked through a list of repairs and improvements that accumulated during busier times. They oiled the gearing, replaced worn rope, reinforced the hopper's mounting, sharpened tools, reorganized storage. Each task was small but necessary, contributing to the mill's overall health. Margaret often joined them for the midday meal, bringing food and companionship. The three of them would sit near the hearth, and conversation would range across many topics: memories of past winters, plans for spring planting, village news that Margaret gathered at the well and market. These hours felt precious to Oswald, different from the focused intensity of harvest season, allowing space for relationship and reflection. One particularly cold afternoon, with wind driving snow horizontally past the doorway, William suggested they work on the millstones' remaining furrows. They brought the tools inside and settled around the stones, and William continued Oswald's education in this skilled work. The younger man's technique had improved considerably since his first attempts, and William nodded approvingly as Oswald worked through one furrow, then another. "You have good hands for this," William observed, watching Oswald strike the chisel with controlled precision. "Patient hands, careful hands. The mill will be well served when it becomes your responsibility." Oswald paused, setting down the hammer. "Do you think about what comes after?" he asked, the question emerging before he had fully formed it. "After you can no longer work the mill, I mean. What you will do with your days." William smiled, his bearded face peaceful. "I think about it often," he said. "I imagine sitting by the river, watching the wheel turn, knowing it is in good hands. Perhaps helping with small tasks when my strength allows, but mostly just being present, offering advice when asked, otherwise staying out of your way. That seems a good way to spend one's final years, close to the work that defined your life but released from its demands." The answer satisfied something in Oswald, a question he had not known he was carrying. The idea of William nearby, still present but no longer burdened by responsibility, felt right. Continuity without burden, connection without obligation. They returned to work, and the afternoon passed in the comfortable silence of shared labor. Outside, snow continued falling, and darkness came early as winter afternoons do. They lit candles against the gloom and worked by their flickering light until William declared the day's tasks complete. That evening, Oswald sat in the loft longer than usual before sleeping, wrapped in his blanket watching snow fall past the window. The flakes were visible against the darkness, each one following its own path downward, joining countless others on the ground below. The wheel turned beneath him, its voice muffled slightly by snow, and the river flowed dark and strong, carrying cold from distant hills. He thought about William's words, about future years when the mill would be fully his to tend. The prospect no longer felt distant or abstract. It felt approaching, inevitable, something to prepare for rather than merely imagine. And beneath that awareness lay deep contentment, gratitude for this life he had been given, this work that suited him so completely. The days continued in their winter pattern. More snow fell, accumulating in the yard and along the riverbanks, transforming the landscape into something both familiar and strange. The mill's work slowed further. Sometimes 2 or 3 days would pass with no visitors, and they would simply tend to maintenance and sit by the hearth, talking or working on small projects. William taught Oswald to read the mill's account books, explaining how to track grain received and flour delivered, payments made and owed, expenses for repairs and supplies. The numbers came less easily to Oswald than physical work, but he persevered, understanding their importance. A miller needed more than strong hands and mechanical knowledge. He needed to manage the business aspects as well. Margaret taught him other skills during this slower season. She showed him how to mend his own clothes, demonstrating stitches that would hold under strain. She taught him which herbs to dry and store for various ailments, feverfew for headaches, chamomile for troubled sleep, mint for digestion. A man living alone needs such knowledge, she said, her capable hands sorting through bundles hanging from the cottage's rafters. You cannot always rely on others to tend to these matters. Alice visited more frequently now, her father's baking slower in winter, meaning she had time to spare. Sometimes she brought her spinning, and she would work beside Margaret while the women talked and Oswald listened, absorbing the rhythms of their conversation. Other times she came simply to sit by the mill's hearth, reading from a prayer book her father had given her, her lips moving silently through familiar words. One afternoon, Alice asked Oswald to walk with her through the snowy village. They bundled warmly and set out, their boots crunching through snow that had crusted overnight. The village was quiet, smoke rising from chimneys in straight lines against the still air, few people venturing outside except when necessary. They walked to the church, where the priest was tending the small garden plot that in warmer months grew herbs for healing. Even in winter, he maintained it, clearing snow from certain hardy plants, checking that protective coverings remained secure. Father Benedict, Alice called in greeting. The priest looked up, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "Alice Oswald, what brings you out in such cold?" he asked, straightening slowly. "Restlessness," Alice admitted. "Too many hours indoors makes a person crave movement, even in winter." The priest nodded, understanding. "Come inside and warm yourselves. I have just brewed mint tea." They followed him into the church, where candles burned before the altar and the air held the scent of beeswax and incense. The priest's small room adjoined the sanctuary, and he poured tea from a pot sitting near his fire. The three of them sat together, hands wrapped around warm cups, and Father Benedict spoke of winter's spiritual lessons, about waiting and patience, about faith that spring would return even when all seemed frozen and dormant. "The mill continues turning," Father Benedict observed to Oswald. "I hear its voice even from here, constant through all seasons. There is something in that constant worth contemplating, faithful work, continuing regardless of circumstance." Oswald had never thought of the mill in spiritual terms before, but he recognized truth in the priest's words. The wheel turned through festivals and ordinary days, through abundance and scarcity, through joy and sorrow. It simply continued, faithful to its purpose, asking nothing but offering everything. When they departed, Walking back through snow that had begun falling again, Alice was quiet for a long while. Finally, she spoke. "I am glad we are friends," she said simply. "You understand things without needing them explained. That is a rare quality." Oswald felt warmth that had nothing to do with walking or exertion. "I am glad too," he replied. "You make the world feel less solitary, even when I spend days alone at the mill." They walked the rest of the way in comfortable silence, and when they reached the mill, Alice continued toward the village while Oswald watched her figure grow smaller against the white landscape. Something had shifted between them, not dramatically, but noticeably. A deepening, perhaps, or simply an acknowledgement of what already existed. Inside the mill, William was working on a new project, carving a replacement handle for one of the grain shovels. His gnarled hands moved the knife with surprising delicacy, shaving thin curls of wood that fell to the floor like pale ribbons. He looked up as Oswald entered, brushing snow from his cloak. "You walked with Alice," William observed, his tone carrying neither question nor judgment, simply acknowledgement. "We visited Father Benedict," Oswald said, hanging his cloak near the hearth to dry. "He spoke of the mill's constancy, how it continues regardless of season." William nodded, returning his attention to the carving. "The priest sees clearly. The mill does continue, it must, because people always need flour, winter or summer. But the constancy requires tending. Without care, even the most faithful wheel will fail." He paused, examining the handle's curve. "The same is true of friendships, I suspect. They require attention, even when, perhaps especially when, nothing urgent demands it." Oswald understood the gentle guidance beneath his master's words. William rarely spoke directly about personal matters, preferring to offer wisdom through observation and letting Oswald draw his own conclusions. The approach suited them both, less intrusive than direct advice, more respectful of Oswald's growing independence. The afternoon passed quietly. Oswald took inventory of their remaining grain supplies, noting quantities in the ledger with careful script. His handwriting had improved under William's patient instruction, though it would never achieve the flowing elegance of Brother Anselm's practiced hand. Still, the letters were legible and the numbers accurate, which served the purpose well enough. As twilight approached, Margaret appeared with an invitation to supper. They crossed the snowy yard to the cottage, where warmth and the scent of baking bread greeted them. The meal was hearty: thick stew with root vegetables, dark bread spread with butter and honey, dried apples stewed with cinnamon. They ate slowly, savoring both food and company. The baker's wife mentioned that Alice has been practicing new recipes, Margaret said, her capable hands breaking bread. "Apparently, she has real talent for the work, understanding instinctively what many learn only through years of trial." "She spoke of it," Oswald said, remembering their conversation. "She compared it to how I understand the mill, knowledge that goes beyond instruction." "Such gifts often find each other," Margaret observed, her graying auburn hair catching firelight. "People who understand their work deeply recognize similar dedication in others. It creates natural kinship." The conversation moved on to other topics, but Oswald found himself thinking about Margaret's words. Was there kinship between him and Alice beyond simple friendship? The possibility felt both foreign and somehow inevitable, as though he was recognizing something that had been present all along but unnamed. After supper, he returned to the mill through darkness lit by snow's reflected starlight. The world felt suspended, held in winter's quiet embrace. Inside the loft, he lit a candle and settled beneath his blanket, but sleep seemed distant despite the day's activities. He rose and moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. The wheel turned below, dark against white, its motion hypnotic and soothing. Somewhere beyond the village, beyond the fields and forests, the world continued in ways he could barely imagine. Great cities with their crowds and commerce, the sea with its endless horizons, mountains touching clouds. But here, in this small corner of existence, was everything he needed. The mill with its patient rhythms, William and Margaret with their steady affection, Alice with her quick laughter and understanding silence, the river flowing eternal, the wheel turning faithful, work that filled his days with purpose and meaning. Contentment settled over him like snow, soft, complete, transforming everything it touched. He returned to his mattress and finally slept, his 17-year-old body relaxed, his flour-dusted hands at rest, his sandy brown hair dark against the pillow. Dreams came gently, if they came at all, carrying him through the night on currents as reliable as the river itself. The winter weeks continued their slow progression. Snow fell and melted and fell again, each storm adding to the accumulated white. The river never froze completely. Its current ran too strong, but ice thickened along the banks, creating strange formations that caught light and fractured it into brief rainbows. Work at the mill remained intermittent. Farmers came occasionally with grain for milling, and Oswald and William would engage the stones and complete the work efficiently before returning to their winter projects. The list of repairs and improvements gradually shortened as they worked through each task with methodical care. One morning, William announced they would spend the day sharpening all the mill's cutting tools, axes, adzes, knives, chisels. They laid them out on the workbench and began with the whetstones, adding water to create the proper slurry for sharpening. The work required patience and attention, maintaining correct angles, checking each edge for trueness. Oswald found the work meditative, the rhythmic scrape of metal against stone creating a sound that joined with the wheel's distant splash. His hands moved steadily, and his mind drifted through pleasant thoughts, recent conversations with Alice, the satisfaction of seeing winter's repair work nearly complete, anticipation of spring's eventual return. "You have grown considerably since you first arrived," William said, examining an axe blade Oswald had just sharpened. "Not just in skill, though that too, but in your bearing, your confidence. You move through the world differently now." Oswald considered this, recognizing truth in the observation. He did feel different than the uncertain 14-year-old who had first come to Apprentice. 3 years of steady work had built both competence and self-assurance. He knew his capabilities now, understood his worth, carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had found his place. "You taught me that," Oswald said simply, "through patience and example." William shook his head slightly. "I taught you the mill's workings, The rest, the man you are becoming, that comes from within. I merely provided space for it to unfold." The conversation settled into comfortable silence as they returned to their work. By afternoon, every blade was sharp, every tool ready for spring's demands. They cleaned and oiled each piece before returning it to storage, treating even simple tools with the respect William insisted all things deserved. As the day waned, Alice arrived with her father. Thomas the baker carried a large basket, and his round belly and silver-streaked black hair were dusted with flour from the day's baking. "We have brought supper," he announced cheerfully. "Margaret insisted we all eat together, and my wife packed enough food to feed the entire village." They gathered in the cottage as darkness fell outside. The table was crowded with people and food, bread and cheese, cold meat and pickled vegetables, ale and cider. Conversation flowed easily, laughter punctuating stories and reminiscences. Oswald found himself seated beside Alice, their shoulders nearly touching in the cramped space, and he was acutely aware of her presence in a way that felt both new and entirely natural. After the meal, as the adults settled into deeper conversation, Alice gestured toward the door. "Walk with me," she asked quietly. They bundled into their cloaks and stepped into the night. The cold was sharp but still, and stars blazed overhead with winter's particular brilliance. Their breath clouded white as they walked slowly toward the river, their boots squeaking on packed snow. At the water's edge, they stood watching the wheel turn, its motion just visible in starlight. The splash it made seemed amplified by the night's quiet, and ice along the banks gleamed pale and ghostly. "I have been thinking," Alice said, her voice soft, "about what I want from life. Not in grand terms, but in simple ones. A home, meaningful work, someone to share days with. It seems like such modest ambition, but it is what I truly want." Oswald understood completely. "That is what I want too," he said. "The mill provides the work and the home. The sharing, that is the piece I have only recently begun to consider." Alice turned to face him, her red hair hidden beneath her hood but her expression visible in the starlight. "We understand each other," she said. "We always have. Perhaps that understanding could become something more if we both wished for it." The moment stretched between them, full of possibility and gentle invitation. Oswald felt his heart beating steadily, calmly, despite the significance of what was being offered. "I would wish that," he said quietly, "if you are certain." "I am certain," Alice replied, and her quick laugh carried warmth that pushed back the cold. "I have been certain for weeks, perhaps longer. I was simply waiting for the right moment to speak it." They stood together in the winter darkness, not touching but connected nonetheless by words spoken and understanding shared. The wheel turned beside them, the river flowed beneath stars, and something new began, something that felt both momentous and perfectly natural, as inevitable as seasons changing or bread rising or grain becoming flour. Eventually, the cold drove them back to the cottage, where the gathering was beginning to disperse. Thomas and his wife prepared to return to the village, and Alice joined them, but not before catching Oswald's eye with a smile that held promise and contentment in equal measure. After everyone departed, Oswald helped Margaret clear the table while William banked the fire. The work was companionable and familiar, and when it was complete, Oswald bid them both good night and returned to the mill. In the loft, he settled beneath his blanket and lay awake, replaying the evening's conversation. Alice's words echoed in his mind. "We understand each other. Something more. I am certain." The future had shifted, taking on new dimensions he had not fully considered before. Not just the mill's future master, but perhaps a husband, eventually a father, building a life that extended beyond work into family and deeper connection. The prospect brought no anxiety, only the deep contentment that always came when his life's path was clarified. Everything felt aligned: his work, his relationships, his sense of place and purpose. The mill would be here, William and Margaret would guide him, Alice would walk beside him, and together they would build something lasting and good. Sleep came gently, carrying him into rest as snow began falling again outside, covering the world in fresh white, making everything clean and new. The wheel turned through the darkness, faithful and constant, and Oswald slept peacefully, held safe within the mill's sheltering walls, his future unfolding before him like a path through snow, clear, inviting, leading somewhere beautiful and true. Morning arrived with pale light filtering through clouds heavy with unspent snow. Oswald woke slowly, the memory of last night's conversation with Alice settling over him like warmth. He dressed and descended to find the mill quiet, William not yet arriving from the cottage. The solitude felt welcome, giving him space to carry his thoughts without interruption. He built up the fire in the hearth, watching flames catch and grow, their light pushing back the morning's grayness. The wheel turned outside, its voice steady as always, and he stood in the doorway observing the river's dark flow. Ice had thickened overnight along the banks, narrowing the channel slightly, but the current remained strong enough to keep the wheel moving without strain. William appeared as the morning brightened, carrying a jug of warm milk and bread wrapped in cloth. "Margaret thought you might appreciate breakfast," he said, setting both on the bench near the fire. His gnarled hands looked stiff from the cold, and he flexed them slowly near the flames. They ate together in comfortable silence, and if William noticed any change in Oswald's demeanor, he gave no sign. The older man simply shared the meal, then suggested they spend the morning checking the grain storage for any signs of moisture or pests, winter work that required attention but allowed the mind to wander. They moved to the storage shed, where sacks stood stacked in careful rows. Each one needed inspection, checking for dampness that could spoil grain or evidence of mice that might have found their way inside. The work was methodical and unhurried, and Oswald found his hands moving through the tasks while his thoughts drifted to Alice, to the life they might build together. "You seem content this morning," William observed, lifting a sack to check beneath it. "More so than usual, if that is possible." Oswald smiled, recognizing the invitation to speak if he wished. "Alice and I talked last evening about the future, about understanding between us. It seems we want similar things from life." William nodded, his bearded face showing quiet approval. "That is a good foundation for building anything lasting. Similar values, mutual respect, work that each understands. Many marriages begin with far less." The word marriage hung in the air between them, making explicit what had only been implied. Oswald felt a flutter of something, not nervousness exactly, but awareness of significance. Marriage meant commitment, building a household, eventually children if God willed it. His life would expand beyond the mill's immediate demands into something larger, more complex. "Do you think I am ready for such responsibility?" Oswald asked, the question emerging before he could consider whether he wanted to voice it. William set down the sack he was examining and turned to face Oswald fully. "Ready is not something you become all at once," he said thoughtfully. "It is something you grow into through living. You are ready to begin, which is all anyone can be. The rest comes through time and attention and choosing each day to honor your commitments." The answer satisfied something in Oswald, dissolving uncertainty into simple clarity. He did not need to have everything figured out before beginning. He simply needed to begin with good intentions and willingness to learn. They completed the storage inspection, finding everything in good order. A few sacks in one corner showed signs of dampness, and these they moved to drier locations, making note to mill their contents first when work resumed. The shed's roof was sound, its walls solid, everything properly maintained. By midday, snow had begun falling again, large, soft flakes that drifted down without urgency. Margaret appeared with the midday meal, and the three of them ate near the hearth while watching the snow accumulate outside. The world beyond the doorway grew increasingly white and muffled, sounds softened, distances obscured. "Alice will visit tomorrow," Margaret mentioned casually, cutting bread with her capable hands. "She asked if I needed help with spinning, but I suspect she simply wishes to spend time near the mill." Oswald felt warmth rise in his chest at this news. Tomorrow suddenly seemed far away, though only hours separated now from then. He found himself anticipating her arrival with an eagerness that surprised him, not anxious or agitated, but simply looking forward with pleasant expectation. The afternoon brought more snow, and visibility decreased until even the nearest willows were barely distinguishable. William declared it too poor for outside work, so they remained in the mill, occupied with small indoor tasks. Oswald oiled the gearing mechanisms while William mended harness leather, both working by firelight as the shortened winter day faded early into twilight. Evening arrived imperceptibly, the snowy dimness simply deepening until candles became necessary. William departed for the cottage, reminding Oswald to keep the fire built up through the night. The cold would intensify once darkness fully settled. Oswald assured him he would, and after his master left, he climbed to the loft to retrieve his second blanket. The snow had stopped by the time full darkness arrived, and the clouds parted to reveal stars. The temperature dropped sharply in the clearing, and frost formed on the inside of the loft's small window. Oswald wrapped both blankets around himself and sat watching his breath cloud white in the candlelight. Tomorrow Alice will come. Tomorrow they would talk more, perhaps begin making plans, not detailed schemes, but general shapes of a shared future. When would they marry? Where would they live? The mill had space in the loft for two, though it would be cramped. Perhaps they could expand, add a small room, and create proper living quarters. William and Margaret might have thoughts on this, having navigated similar questions decades earlier. Sleep came eventually despite his active thoughts, and his dreams were pleasant. Images of Alice laughing, of bread rising, of the mill continuing its work while snow fell outside. He woke once in the deepest part of night to add wood to the fire below, then returned to his blankets and slept again until dawn. Morning brought Alice earlier than expected. Oswald was just breaking his fast when she appeared, her red hair bright against the snow's whiteness, her breath clouding in the cold air. She carried a basket covered with cloth, and her expression barely contained excitement. "I brought fresh cinnamon rolls," she said, entering the mill quickly to escape the cold. "Father made them this morning and they are still warm. I thought we could share them while we talked." They settled near the hearth, and Alice unwrapped the basket to reveal rolls glazed with honey and studded with precious cinnamon. The scent filled the mill, rich and sweet, and they ate slowly, savoring both the food and the moment. "I told my father about our conversation," Alice said after a while, "about wanting to build something together. He was pleased. He has always liked you and said you have an honest quality that serves a person well." "William said something similar about you," Oswald replied, "that you understand your work deeply, which creates natural kinship with others who do the same." They talked through the morning, conversation flowing easily between practical considerations and simple enjoyment of each other's company. Alice suggested they marry in the spring, after Easter, when the weather would be more reliable and travel easier for any relatives wishing to attend. Oswald agreed, finding the timeline felt right. Enough time to prepare properly, but not so long that waiting became burdensome. "We could expand the loft," Oswald suggested. "Add a proper room with a window facing south for light. William knows carpentry well enough to guide the work, and I can learn as we build." Alice's expression showed pleasure at this practical planning. "And I can continue helping my father while learning to manage a household. Margaret has offered to teach me her recipes, her methods for preserving and preparing. By spring, I will be ready." The confidence in her voice matched what Oswald felt, not arrogance, but simple certainty that they possessed what they needed to succeed. Work ethic, patience, mutual respect, and affection that was growing deeper each time they spoke. These seemed like sufficient foundations for building a life. Margaret appeared at midday, ostensibly to bring food but clearly hopping to find Alice present. The three of them ate together, and conversation turned to wedding preparations. What needed to be arranged, who should be invited, what traditions should be observed. Margaret's experience proved valuable, and she offered suggestions gently, never insisting but providing guidance where it was welcome. "The mill will provide steady income," Margaret said, her graying auburn hair neat despite the morning's work. "Not wealth, but sufficiency. You will always have flour to trade for other necessities, and William's reputation ensures steady business. It is a good foundation for a young family." The word family created another shift in Oswald's awareness: children, eventually, if they were blessed. The loft expansion would need to account for that possibility, creating space for growth beyond just the two of them. The thought brought tenderness rather than worry, imagining small hands learning to love the mill as he had learned, teaching the next generation what William had taught him. Alice departed in the afternoon, needing to return to help her father with evening baking. Oswald watched her walk away through snow that had begun falling again lightly, her figure eventually disappearing beyond the willows. The mill felt emptier after her departure, but not lonely, simply quieter, holding space for her return. William appeared shortly after, and they worked together on planning the loft expansion. William sketched rough designs in the dusty floor with a stick, showing how they could extend outward without compromising the mill's structure. The work would require perhaps 2 months if they labored steadily, completing it well before the spring wedding Alice had suggested. "We will begin when the worst cold passes," William said, studying his rough drawings. "February usually brings a brief warming before winter's final push. That will be the time to work with timber and tools." The plan settled something in Oswald, making the future feel more concrete and approachable. Not some distant possibility, but something actively being built through present choices and preparations. He would marry Alice in the spring. They would live in the expanded loft. The mill would continue its work, and their life would unfold around its rhythms, shaped by seasons and steady labor. That evening, Oswald sat by the loft window longer than usual, wrapped in both blankets against the cold. The river flowed below, dark between white banks, and the wheel turned with its patient constancy. Stars emerged as clouds cleared, brilliant in the winter sky, and the moon rose late, nearly full, casting silver light across the snow. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, arriving as an uncertain boy, learning through William's patient instruction, discovering work that suited him completely, finding Alice and recognizing in her a partner for building life. Each piece had fallen into place naturally, not through grand design but through simple choices made day by day, attention given to what mattered, patience with time's unfolding. The mill had been here before him and would be here after him, faithful across generations. But for now, for these years, it was his to tend alongside William, soon alongside Alice as well. That felt like enough, more than enough. It felt like everything. Sleep came gently, carrying him into rest as the wheel turned and the river flowed and winter held the world in its cold embrace. Tomorrow would bring more work, more planning, more small steps toward the spring that waited beyond winter's depths. And Oswald slept peacefully, 17 years old with flour-dusted hands and sandy brown hair, his future bright and clear before him, his heart content within the mill's sheltering walls. The days that followed brought a steady rhythm of work and preparation. Snow continued falling intermittently, and the cold deepened as January progressed into its coldest weeks. The river never froze completely, but ice thickened along its edges until the channel narrowed considerably, and the wheel's voice changed slightly, taking on a different tone as it worked against winter's resistance. Oswald and William spent much of their time indoors, working on projects that could be completed near the hearth's warmth. They repaired harnesses and ropes, sharpened and oiled tools repeatedly, and organized the storage areas with meticulous care. The work was modest but satisfying, each small task contributing to the mill's overall readiness for spring's busier season. Alice visited 3 or 4 times each week, sometimes bringing food from her father's ovens, other times simply coming to sit by the fire and talk. Her presence had become woven into the mill's daily patterns, as natural as the wheels turning or the river's flow. She and Margaret often worked together on spinning or mending, while Oswald and William attended to their tasks, and the mill filled with quiet conversation and the comfortable sounds of people sharing space. One afternoon, Brother Anselm arrived unexpectedly, his dark robes dusted with snow, his ink-stained fingers clutching a wrapped bundle. "I have brought something for you," he told Oswald, his thoughtful gray eyes warm despite the cold. "A small gift in anticipation of your spring wedding." Inside the wrapping was a book, small, bound in leather, its pages filled with carefully copied text. "It is a psalter," Brother Anselm explained. "Prayers for daily use, copied in our scriptorium. Every household should have such a book, for marking the hours and seasons, for finding comfort in difficult times. This one I copied myself, thinking of you and Alice as I worked." Oswald accepted the gift with profound gratitude, understanding the hours of labor it represented. Each page was covered in neat script, the letters formed with precision and care, occasional decorative capitals adding beauty to the text. "I will treasure this," he said quietly. "We both will." Brother Anselm stayed for a meal, and conversation ranged across many topics: the abbey's winter routines, plans for the scriptorium's expansion, theological questions that the monk enjoyed exploring aloud. William engaged with these discussions thoughtfully, his gnarled hands gesturing occasionally to emphasize a point, and Oswald listened, absorbing wisdom that went beyond the mill's mechanical knowledge into larger questions of meaning and purpose. After the monk departed, Oswald carried the psalter carefully to the loft and placed it on the shelf where it would stay safe and dry. The book represented more than religious text. It symbolized connection to the wider community, the abbey's blessing on his coming marriage, the continuation of traditions older than memory. February arrived with the brief warming William had predicted. The temperature rose enough that snow began melting during daylight hours, though it refroze each night into treacherous ice. This was the window they needed for beginning the loft expansion, and they seized it immediately. The work began with careful measuring and planning. William showed Oswald how to calculate the dimensions needed, how to ensure the addition would balance properly with the existing structure, and how to source timber of appropriate size and quality. They purchased wood from a carpenter in the village who specialized in such materials, arranging for delivery once the plans were finalized. The timber arrived on a clear, cold morning, carried by cart, and unloaded carefully near the mill. Each beam and board was inspected for quality, checking for knots that might weaken the wood, ensuring proper seasoning, verifying measurements. Oswald ran his flour-dusted hands along the smooth surfaces, imagining how these raw materials would transform into living space for him and Alice. They began construction on a day when the sun shone bright despite the cold, making outdoor work tolerable if not comfortable. William directed while Oswald did much of the physical labor, measuring, cutting, fitting pieces together with careful attention to angles and joints. The work required both strength and precision, and Oswald found himself drawing on everything William had taught him about patience and accuracy. Alice came to observe progress most afternoons, often bringing hot cider or soup to warm them during breaks. She offered suggestions about the interior layout, where a window might best be placed, how to arrange space for sleeping and storage, where hooks and shelves would prove most useful. Her practical mind complemented Oswald's, and together they refined the design as construction progressed. Margaret contributed as well, sewing curtains from cloth she had woven and dyed herself, a soft blue that reminded Oswald of twilight skis. She worked on these by the cottage fire during evenings, her capable hands moving the needle with practiced efficiency, and she would display her progress whenever Oswald came for meals. The construction took longer than initially estimated. Winter weather interrupted work frequently, forcing them indoors for days at a time when snow or freezing rain made outdoor labor impossible. But gradually, steadily, the addition took shape. Walls rose, a roof was fitted and secured. A south-facing window was installed to capture daylight. By late February, the structure was essentially complete, needing only finishing touches, sealing gaps against drafts, installing the shelves and hooks Alice had requested, laying fresh straw for the mattress they would share. Oswald worked on these details with special care, wanting everything to be as perfect as his skills allowed. One evening, as he was applying oil to the new floorboards to protect them and bring out the wood's natural beauty, Alice climbed the ladder to inspect the completed space. She moved slowly through the addition, running her hands along walls, testing the window's shutters, examining the shelves with evident satisfaction. "It is beautiful," she said finally, turning to face Oswald with her quick laugh bright in the dim space. "You have built us a proper home. I can imagine waking here, looking out this window at the river, beginning each day together." Oswald felt pride swell in his chest, not the sharp pride that seeks praise, but the deeper satisfaction of having created something good through patient effort. "It will be our home," he said. "The mill's work will support us and this space will shelter us. That seems like everything we need." They stood together in the gathering darkness, and Alice moved closer, resting her head briefly against his shoulder. The gesture was simple but intimate, a physical expression of the bond forming between them. Oswald remained still, honoring the moment, feeling her warmth and the rightness of her presence. Eventually, Alice descended to return to the village before full darkness made the path treacherous. Oswald watched her go, then remained in the new room, lighting a candle and sitting on the floor to simply be present in the space he had created. The walls smelled of fresh wood and oil. The window-framed stars began to appear in the darkening sky, and everything felt suspended between past and future, between what had been and what would be. March arrived with the first hints of spring's approach. Days lengthened noticeably, and though cold remained, it had lost winter's deepest edge. Snow melted more than it accumulated, revealing muddy ground and the first green shoots pushing through dead vegetation. The river's voice changed as ice broke away from the banks, and the wheel turned faster, energized by increased flow. The wedding date approached, the third Sunday after Easter, when the weather would be reliably mild, and the village chapel would be decorated with spring flowers. Preparations intensified as the day drew near. Margaret worked with Alice on her wedding dress, altering a gown that had belonged to Margaret's mother, updating it with new embroidery and careful mending. Oswald had only his blue tunic, which Margaret declared would serve perfectly if properly cleaned and pressed. Father Benedict met with them several times to discuss the ceremony, explaining the vows they would exchange, the blessings he would offer, the traditions that would be observed. The priest's weathered face showed pleasure in presiding over their union, and he spoke of marriage as a partnership blessed by God, two people choosing to walk through life together, supporting and strengthening each other through all seasons. The week before the wedding, William announced that he and Margaret would host a small gathering after the ceremony, just close friends and family, sharing a meal and celebrating the occasion properly. Margaret immediately began planning the menu, and Alice's father offered to provide bread and pastries from his ovens. The preparations took on their own momentum, carrying everyone forward toward the approaching day. Oswald found himself moving through these final days in a state of peaceful anticipation, not nervous or anxious, but simply aware that life was about to shift significantly. The mill continued its work throughout. Grain still needed milling, and he and William maintained their routines even as the wedding preparations swirled around them. 2 days before the ceremony, as Oswald was checking the wheel's paddles for any damage from the spring's increased water flow, he noticed Alice approaching along the river path. She walked slowly, and something in her bearing made him set aside his work and go to meet her. "I wanted to see you alone," she said when they met, "before everything becomes formal and public, to tell you that I am grateful for your patience, your kindness, your steadiness. I could not ask for a better partner to build a life with." Oswald felt emotion rise in his throat, making words momentarily difficult. "I am grateful too," he finally managed. "You have given me something I did not know I was missing, companionship that goes beyond simple friendship, someone who understands not just what I do, but why I do it." They walked together along the river, following the path downstream where willows were beginning to show the first hints of green on their branches. The air held spring's particular scent, earth awakening, water flowing freely, growing things pushing toward light. Everything felt poised on the edge of renewal, and their coming marriage was part of that larger pattern of seasons turning, life continuing, generations following generations in endless succession. When they returned to the mill, William was waiting with cups of ale and news that Brother Anselm had sent word. The abbey would provide wine for the wedding feast, a generous gift that spoke of the monk's affection for both Oswald and Alice. This kindness joined the many others that had accumulated, and Oswald felt overwhelmed by the community's support, by how many people had invested themselves in celebrating this union. The final day before the wedding passed in a blur of last preparations. Oswald cleaned the mill thoroughly, wanting it presentable for anyone who might visit afterward. He bathed in the river despite the water's coldness, scrubbing away flour dust and work's accumulated evidence. Margaret trimmed his sandy brown hair again, shaping it more carefully than his own rough efforts had managed, and she inspected his blue tunic with critical eyes before declaring it acceptable. That night, sleeping alone in the loft for what would be the last time in his current life, Oswald lay awake listening to the mill's familiar sounds. The wheel turned below, the river flowed past, and somewhere in the village Alice was likely awake as well, perhaps experiencing similar thoughts about endings and beginnings. He thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment, arriving as an uncertain boy, learning patience and skill, discovering work that fulfilled him completely, finding in Alice someone who complemented and completed him. Every step had led here, to this threshold between solitary life and partnership, between apprentice and master, between youth and full adulthood.